All right. So, good morning, everyone. And today we would be going for the day 4 of our React.js training. And the day 4 would consist more or less learning Redux only. But then we'd also have a Redux and a React application altogether. So, that is also something that we'd be doing. We already saw the need of Redux in the previous day's session. And I'm not going for this task manager application at all this time around. So I'd be going for another, dummy application. So we'd be going for that, but not the task manager. So today's session would be solely dedicated to Redux, and we'd be doing 2 exercises today. Thereby, we'd know enough so that we can implement Redux in our task manager project. So the agenda for today would be first to get a Redux plus JavaScript example ready. And it's a very basic example so that we are focusing on Redux at this point, so we don't want to clutter ourselves or clutter our learning process with bigger examples. So that's why just a small example this time. And this example would be a counter, Redux plus JavaScript. And then the same example, we'd be going for Redux plus React with that create React app. Now, counter, it's a very basic, it has a very basic functionality itself. Like there will be a plus button, a minus button, and when you click on plus, the counter increments, and when you click minus, the counter would decrement. So this is what we are building towards. All right. So I believe the agenda is pretty much clear for today. Is that correct? All right. Very good. And in the process, we'd be learning Redux as our library. And there is also another library called React Redux. But the React Redux library, it's not something that we'll be going for today. We may be going for it on Friday's session, where we'd be actually bridging React and Redux. And that way, we would also be getting our task manager up with Redux. Plus, we'd use that React Redux library. That is the standard way of going for it. So whenever you go for React and Redux together, you need 2 libraries. Apart from React and React DOM, you need Redux and then another library called React Redux. But we are not discussing that right now. We'll just be focusing on Redux itself. When we go for Redux, we also would like to, I would like to point out one link to you that is regarding something called Flux. And this is basically the initial concept of state management that Facebook introduced. But then when Redux came into the market, it also does the same thing, by the way. Redux and Flux, they both do the same thing. But then when Redux came into the market, it is very, what do we say? Um, very compact as a library. It doesn't have any overheads. And Facebook also likes the Redux library. So Facebook nowadays recommends that we should go for Redux rather than Flux. So nowadays, what happens is that Flux is merely a concept that people may or may not learn, but the implementation would be Redux altogether. So we would be focusing totally on Redux, but I would suggest that you go ahead and watch this introductory video on Flux. That'll be really a good way to move forward. Right? So it's like a 45 minutes video or something. It's an initial presentation of how Flux was envisioned. So that is something that I would like you to take forward. All right. However, today we are going to just learn Redux and we'll be implementing Redux altogether. So we would learn all about Redux, what are the entities that are involved as far as a Redux program is concerned. And I would also provide you a presentation. So let me just get that presentation from somewhere. I'm just taking it from my drive on another screen. So React plus Redux. And let me just download it. I'm just doing the whole thing on another screen. I'm sorry for that. Okay, so this one PDF that I just downloaded, which is over here. All right, so this is the PDF that I would be giving you. It is basically a small diagram describing how Redux would work, and we'd go through this as well to see how things go as far as Redux is concerned. All right, so when we talk about Redux, let me first go to the official website, and the official website also has a very good tutorial. I would, if you know, time permits, maybe during the weekend or something, it would be a very good idea if you go through the official website's getting started tutorial. It is available as a text, and also there are video tutorials that are also there, I guess, or maybe not, but somewhere around I saw that there were video tutorials as well. But this is like a very beautiful tutorial that Redux has provided to us. So I would suggest that you go through this. But if we go through the website, the definition of Redux is this: it's a predictable state container for React.js apps. Now, what is a state container, and what is predictable, and all those things we would just like to explore in this particular session. Let me first copy the URL, paste it in the chat. Oh, sorry, paste it in the notepad. And I'd also copy this definition because there's no better definition to it that I can provide. It's a predictable state container for JavaScript apps. All right. So it's not a React specific thing. It's not necessary at all that you use Redux with React, but it has been a popular combination. And more or less, Redux works as React expects it to, and Redux takes the React.js concepts to a next level. For example, if you want to understand Redux based on whatever we have learned in React, imagine a component state. When the state changes, the component re-renders, right? And that state, if you just take it one level up to the entire application and make it global, so that when that global state changes, the component re-renders. So that is basically what Redux is. But that global variable is well managed so that we can debug that particular variable if necessary. And there is a process associated to the change in that global variable. So that global state has a process, and the process goes something like this. And I would first like to just introduce a couple of terms in here. Like whenever we go for Redux itself, there are certain things that we'll be learning. One thing is actions, then reducers, then store. Three things. All right, actions, reducers, and store. These are the three things that we'll be learning. And the store is basically the global one, the global entity where all the data resides. But then you may also think that the day we started programming in colleges, or maybe even before that, and in the companies, that when you were a junior developer, you were always advised against creating global variables, right? That we should never create global variables. And that is also a good reason. There is also a good reason to it. Like if we create a global variable, and if all the components or all the modules start changing that global variable, we would never have the track of what module changed what, so that the output is this, so at the time when there is an error, it would really be very difficult to debug that error. So that's true, we should never declare a global variable. Plus Redux, it's a global store. All right, plus it's a single global store, singleton. So what made the developers convinced about Redux being a global store and using it? So in that case, the only answer is that I would like to defer to that global variable notion at this point. Like if you declare a global variable, okay, that's fine. But in order to change that variable, you should have a well-defined process so that it makes the debugging easier. So it is the same thing with Redux. Redux has this global variable, the store, but it has a well-defined process to change that global variable. There's a channel of things that are happening, and that way debugging becomes easier. So global variable is also there, which is already a benefit, but then there is a process to change the variable. And this is the process. View would dispatch an action. Action would invoke a reducer, and reducer would change the store, and store would be then reflected back to the view. All right. A reducer gives you a new store. That is a bit technical. We'll go into that in a deeper fashion. All right. So view dispatches the action. Action invokes the reducer automatically. Reducer gives you a new store, and that new store is back again reflected into the view. So in normal scenario, one would think that we can simply do this. Like view can change the store. Store gets back reflected to the view. Like for example, a component one can change the store, and that gets reflected to the component 2, or maybe in our counter example, the task form changed the store and the store gets reflected into the task list. That kind of a component communication can be established. But then again, if a view is capable of changing the global store, it would really be a problem. So this approach is not advisable. Instead, we go for view dispatching actions, actions invoking the reducers automatically, and reducers setting up the store. All right. So all these examples would have this kind of a flow. It's a unidirectional flow. It starts from view and ends to the view, and it never goes back. Like a view cannot modify the store directly at all. All right. So this is the flow that we'd be going. And let me also write it down, because these are certain statements that are very important. A view would dispatch an action. Dispatch is a very important word, by the way. All right. Action would invoke a reducer automatically. Reducer would provide us or return a new store, and that new store is again reflected back to the view. So if the view wants to change something to the store, the view cannot do it directly. All the view can do is dispatch an action, which is basically a request to Redux to change the store, and Redux take care of the rest. All right. So this is the flow. Okay. And if you want to just go for that flow once more, if we think about React and Redux, the view could be React, for example, and the view would dispatch an action. Action would invoke a reducer. Reducer would give you the new store, and the store would be reflected back to the view again. So this whole flow goes on and on. And you can see that this is a unidirectional flow. The view cannot directly affect the store at all. All right. All that the view can do is dispatch an action. And this setup, where the store, reducer, and action, they work together, this is Redux. And the yellow one, that can be React or any other. It can be jQuery, it can be normal vanilla JavaScript, and so on and so forth. So I believe the flow that Redux would have in order to change that global store, first of all, Redux provides you a global store, and the flow, it is quite predictable. So I believe this flow, it's pretty clear to all. Very good. So this is the flow we'd be going with. All right. And I would provide this presentation to you for your reference, but keep that whole presentation in mind, because in at the starting stages, we'd be developing everything with that particular flow only. So first we'd be creating the view, then the action, then the reducer, then we'd be creating the store, and then we'd be coming back to the view for modifications to integrate the store to the view. All right. So Redux is a predictable state container. It's predictable because there are certain points of predictability where it should not have any side effects. Basically, no API calls should be there. Everything should be constant. So basically immutable. So if it is immutable, the store itself is immutable. The reducer doesn't change the store, but it gives you a new store. All right. So store is immutable. So that brings up the predictability. When you dispatch an action, you know more or less like what would be the end result. And a state container means something like a session, but on the front end. So it's just a browser variable. So one thing is for sure, that when we refresh the browser, everything would be reset. But if you are coming from a backend programming background, you can consider Redux as the state, or sorry, as the session variable. But then session is a very big thing on the server. It is a mini session sort of thing on the client, and hence it is not persistent. You would refresh the screen and everything would reload. All right. So it's a predictable state container for JavaScript apps. So I believe the definition of Redux, and you can also take that analogy of the component state. So Redux is like component state, but global one. Like a component state, but global. Now, a component state, when it's changed, the component re-renders. Similarly, Redux state, when it's changed, the app should re-render. That's the whole logic. And and a view or a component cannot access or maybe cannot modify the state directly, it has to dispatch an action. All right. So a view cannot modify the state directly, it has to dispatch an action. All right. So these are certain things that we should know, and then the flow goes on, like the diagram we saw, like I've described over here. All right. So I believe the definition of Redux and the flow that we would be going for, it is clear to all. Very good. Very good. So now we know that where this views reducers, oh sorry, where the view reducers action and store, where would this be fitting in? We know that part, but now we'd also like to know how would we be coding the views. A view we know how to code, but how would we be coding the action, reducer, and store? So let's see how we code it in JavaScript. If we talk about actions, actions are objects, JavaScript objects, and objects means literals like curly brackets kind of a thing. JavaScript objects with minimum one property called type. All right. Whenever it's an action, we should know what type of an action it is. So it has one property called type. So as an example, we can say that it could be like, for example, if we talk about our counter itself, type increment could be an action. Similarly, type decrement could be another. All right. So if we talk about our task manager, for example, what do you think the type of an action would be if it is a task manager component or task manager functionality that we want to achieve? What are the types of actions there? Anyone? Add. All right. Delete. Cool. So add, delete, as per our functionality, it's just add, delete that can be there. So add task. So very good, Shubham. And delete task. According to the UI that we have created, these two should be the action types. But the problem here is, like, for example, the type increment and type decrement, they are self-explanatory. Like if I say type increment, it means that we should increase the state by 1. All right. That is the type of the action. But if we talk about add task, or for example, if we talk about delete task, okay, the type is delete task. So the action has to be to delete the task, but we don't know what task to delete. All right. So this action is not self-explained, and hence we need some extra data to it. So if it is a delete task, what is the extra data that we should need so that the action is fully explained? Need to pass the ID. Very good, Palak. We need to pass the ID. I believe everyone would agree with Palak on this. Similarly, if we talk about this particular thing, add task, what all data do we need in here? We need to pass an object, maybe a data object, which could have like title blank, description blank, or something like this, or maybe even a task object if possible. All right, which would not be possible to start with, so I'm just settling with this data object. But this kind of extra data can be passed. All right, later on we'll pass the task object itself, like Palak mentioned, and ID for the delete tasks. So this extra data, it is called a payload. So let's say actions may or may not have payloads. All right, may or may not have payloads, depends on the type of the action, and some actions may have it, some actions may not. All right, so this is how you code an action. Actions are JavaScript objects with minimum one property, that is type. They may or may not have a payload. All right, and there's also one thing that we would later like to learn, which is called action generators. We'll see what they are later on. Once we are through with the Redux and JavaScript example, we'll see what are action generators. So I believe everyone is clear on how we'd be coding the actions, right? Okay. All right. So that, and then let's talk about reducers. Now reducers are pure functions. Now we'll see what are pure functions in a while. Pure functions that take in two arguments. One is state and one is action. Now state is the current state and action is this type of an action object that has type as a property, or it also has a payload passed in. All right. So state is the current state of the component, or sorry, not state of the component, but current state of Redux, or current global application state, you may say. Current state, current global app state, that is Redux store, you may also call it Redux store. And then action is the currently dispatched action. So the action state is this, action is the currently dispatched action. So it'll have this action dot type and all those things. All right. So action is the currently dispatched action. Based on the action dot type, the reducer returns a new state. Remember, reducer doesn't change the state, always returns the new state. There is a reason to why it doesn't change the state as well, because if the reducer starts changing the state, the debugging would become difficult. The debugging would only possible if we have the history of state with us, and that is something that the reducer would provide. Without changing the state, it'll create a new state. The state basically gets pushed onto a stack or something like that. So based on the action type, reducer returns as a new state. And as an example of a reducer could be quite simple, like function counter reducer, for example, and state and action can be passed, and then there could be like if else's or switch cases where action dot type is switched or compared to certain cases, which are the type values or which are the action type values. So this could be an example. When task reducer, they would have the same signature, the content of the reducer would vary. All right. So let's also see what are pure functions. All right. Anyone has any ideas on what are pure functions? Anyone may have read it somewhere. And this kind of a thing is probably something related to programming only, like it was there altogether, but probably this Redux scenario came in and it was emphasized more. But if you talk about a pure function, there are two properties how a pure function would be, on the basis of which it would be decided whether it is a pure function or not. So a pure function doesn't have side effects, and it doesn't modify its arguments. All right, whatever the arguments are passed, for example, in here state and action are passed, they don't modify. Pure functions don't modify its arguments. So say for example, now we know that, okay, doesn't modify its argument is pretty clear, but doesn't have any side effects. All right, so what do we mean by side effects? So side effects in one line can be defined as something that is not predictable. And as an example, we may consider an API call to the server. So if we call an API to the server, we would not be able to know while calling the API that what the server would return. The server could return successfully the data to us. The server could maybe return an authentication error or a 404 error if the resource is not available. If we don't have, or if the server doesn't have any proper programming, the server could return 500 internal error. So it is never predictable if it is an API call that what would the server be returning. So that kind of a scenario, it's called a side effect. Whether the result is not predictable at this at any point while calling that particular process. So pure functions do not have side effects. So you can easily conclude that reducers would not be calling an API if we think about that, and it doesn't modify the arguments, and that's why based on the type of action, reducer returns a new state. And I would like to specify here that reducers do not modify the state. They do not modify the state, they return new state. All right. And that's how a history of state is maintained, and you can go back and forth for debugging the whole state. So if we just want to take an example of a pure function, if I create a function like this, increment x, and I return something like plus plus x, incrementing the x variable thereby. So what do you think would this function be? Would this be a pure function, or would this be an impure function? Anyone, any ideas? Rita says it'll be pure. Shweta says not pure. Impure is what Mikshit also says. Impure. All right, very good. Majority is with impure. So obviously it is not pure a function, because here it is doing a plus plus x, which means it is modifying this argument. So let's say if I want to convert it to a pure function, how would I do it? Anyone? Return x. Yeah, but if I return x, then increment would not happen, right? The whole purpose of the function is to increment. If I return x, it will just stay the same. Right, Devin is correct, even Janesh. Return x plus 1, all right? So this would never change x, but then it would also return an incremented value to us. So this becomes a pure function. Increment outside a function doesn't actually make any sense, because increment outside a function would not serve any purpose, because the function itself is for increment, right? So this is a better solution, or we can store it in another variable and then return that variable. That could also be there. So I believe this difference between pure and impure function, it is all clear to all. All right, very good. What about other participants? I would like to just confirm from everyone. All right, so this are the ways that we can code actions, reducers. And now we'd also like to see how we can code a state. State, or you may say store, it's a global application state. All right, and it can be created. It could be of any data type, by the way. So the store could be of any data type. So for example, in our counter example, we'll have the store to be of the data type number, but then in some other example could be something else, depending on what the requirement is for the global data to be stored. But in real world examples, the store is always an object. That way it is better managed. We'll see an example today on how a store can be an object and how can it be managed. But we'll start with a number only, because we want that counter to be our store, right? Store could be of any data type. Store can be created by a redux.create function, or a createStore function is used to create a store. All right, so like example, const store is equal to redux.create store, and here there will be a reducer that we'll be providing. Most of the time it is called the root reducer. Root reducer means the main reducer essentially. It could be a counter reducer, or it could be something else as well, but we'll talk about this root reducer in much detail. The whole thing is like redux.createStore helps us create a store, and it takes in one argument as the reducer. Minimum one argument is required, which is the reducer function, right? I'll just note it down in here as well. createStore method, I'll call it a method, requires minimum one argument, that is the root reducer. And it's not necessary that a root reducer has to be named a root reducer, could be named anything, but basically it's the main reducer. So you'd see that most of the time there'll be only one reducer. For example, in our counter example, there'll be only one reducer, and that'll be the main reducer. Root reducer literally means main reducer. So once you create a store, that would be globally available. All the components would be able to use it, and all the components would be able to dispatch actions to modify the store. So there are three methods available, three main methods as far as the store is concerned. So store, the variable itself, provides us three methods. One is store.getState, then there is store.dispatch, and then there is store.subscribe. All right. So get state would help us to get the Redux state. Redux stores current value. And dispatch would help us to dispatch an action. We know that action dispatch is something that is done by the view. And subscribe, it's like a listener function to the state changes. Whenever the global state changes, the subscribe would listen to it. So it is better that we do the programming for subscribe and see what it does exactly. But get state and dispatch are like very well explained. Get state is used to get the current state of Redux, and dispatch is used to dispatch an action so that it will trigger the whole process of view to actions, then reduce it, then store, and back to the view. All right, so this is what it is. And you can note here that there's no set state available like there was for the components store or component state, but there's only get state available. So set state cannot be done by the view itself that we have already established. View can only dispatch an action. All right. And then there are some other functions that are available via store, or not via store, via Redux. They are combineReducers and apply middleware. All right. We'll see where these are used. As of now, we don't need to know the usage at all, but we'll just list them down, and later we'll see where they are used. All right, these are redux.combineReducer and redux. Apply middleware. So redux.combineReducers, redux.apply middleware. So this is what it is. One thing that I would also like to note in the reducer is that if no action type matches, the reducer function would return the current state. All right, reducer function returns the current state. So basically, actions, JavaScript objects with minimum one property, that is type, and they may or may not have payload depending on what action type it is. Reducers are pure functions. They take in two arguments, state and action, and state is the current global state of the app, that is Redux store, and action is the currently dispatched action. And based on the action type, the reducer returns as a new state. If no action type matches, the reducer function would return the current state. And the reducers do not modify the state. Very important. As an example, we can see this. And then we would like to also see what a store is. Store is the global application state. So basically, it is something like a component state, but global. And store could be of any data type, but in real world examples, the store is always an object. And redux.createStore is the one used to create a store. And createStore method requires minimum one argument, that is root reducer. And it then provides us three methods: store.getState, dispatch, and subscribe, each for one or the other functionality. And there are some other extra methods that are available, which we would check later. So this is how you'd be coding actions, reducers, and store. And there will be only one store that will be coding, though it is possible programmatically to create multiple stores, but it would really be difficult to manage multiple stores inside an application. So I believe this whole thing about store, reducers, and action, how to code them, and how they would be fitting in Redux, I believe this is clear to all. Okay, very good. So this being done, we would like to now we'd now like to go for Redux and JavaScript example with this particular counter that we want to go with. So let me just create a new file, and just keep in mind the diagram. It will be based on the diagram that is the PDF file that I showed you. Based on that we'll be creating different entities in our application. So I'll just create Redux JavaScript.html, open it with my editor, and also open it in a browser. So again, this time around we'd use the CDN approach like we started off with React. With that CDN approach, we'd be going for this Redux as well, and then we'll be using the Create React app altogether. Just type in some HTML here, like Redux JavaScript demo, and what I want is an H1 with a heading, and HR, and H2 would have the whole value of the counter. So I'll give it an ID, counter H2, and a couple of buttons, plus and minus, ID increment and ID decrement. All right, so if I reload, this is what I'll see. Nothing happens on plus, nothing happens on minus, and this is what it is. So before going with Redux and JavaScript, I'll just go only with JavaScript and show you, what would be the result that I want to achieve eventually. So no Redux to start with, just JavaScript. All right. So script, and I'll get all the elements. So const counter h2 is equal to document dot get element by ID, counter h2, const increment button is equal to document dot get element by ID increment, and same for decrement as well. All right, something like this. And we would then like to just store like a variable. Oh, maybe I might just go with var only. What I think is I'll just go with ES6 and ES5 in this particular example. So no ES6, right? Var counter is equal to 0. That'll also give you more idea on how ES5 things are handled. And this eventually would be my Redux store, but right now it's just a variable. And what I want is counter h2 dot inner HTML is equal to counter, something like this. So I get that inner HTML over here, and then I go with increment button on click is equal to a function that would go for counter plus plus, and decrement button on click is a function that would go for counter minus minus. All right. So if I do this and if I refresh, let me also open up my console. If I open up my console, do you think that the counter would be incremented if I start clicking plus and minus in this particular case? Anyone? About the UI is what I'm talking about. Anyone? Any ideas? Mixed says no. No, the counter would not increment. And yes, the counter doesn't increment. What can be the reason? What should we be doing? So basically the counter increments, but it's not showing it in the UI. All right. So anyone, what should we be doing in here? Assign the inner HTML. All right. So basically this line has to be again executed after increment or decrement. So a better way to do it is make it a render function, something like this. Call the initial render so that we get that initial 0, and then have the render called here and here. All right, as simple as that is. So when I refresh, and now if I go for increment and decrement, you'd see that I get the incremented and decremented value. All right. So this is what eventually I want to achieve. This is just JavaScript that I've done, but I would like to go with JavaScript and Redux and convert this counter to the Redux store. All right. So everyone is clear on the problem statement. Yes. Very good. So I'll take off whatever is not necessary now. For example, this is not necessary because that will be a Redux store. This is not necessary. The increment and render call is not necessary. So on click would be nothing. And this. So it is just a simple view file, nothing as a functionality added. So it will not do anything at all. Clicking on plus and minus doesn't do anything at all. And now we would like to add some functionality to it. So our view is ready. So if you recall the diagram, after the view is ready, what should we be creating if we want to go for Redux? Shubham says reducer. Okay, actually we can create anything that we want, but let's go as per the diagram that we saw in the PDF. All right. So Devin and Mixit say action. I believe everyone would agree. Let's create an action, but we can create a reducer, not an issue at all. All right. But we'll go with the diagram for a while so that the whole process sets up in our minds. So increment action. An action is an object. It has minimum one property. What is the property that it would have? Type. Very good. Type. Very good, everyone. It'll be type. Palak says root, but it'll be type. Increment and decrement action. The type would be decrement. All right, something like this. These are the two actions that we want to create at this point, and I believe everyone is clear on the actions that we have. So after the actions, what will be the next step? Anyone? What do we create? Reducer. Very good, Mikshit. I believe everyone would agree with Mikshit on this. Reducer, and we can call it counter reducer. And what are the two arguments that a reducer would expect in here? Okay, one would be state. What about the other one? Action. Very good. So it'll be state and action. Makes it. All right, state and action. And based on the actions type, we need to return something or return a new state. So basically the action, it's the same action object that we have created earlier. One of these two would be there. So we'll see if action dot type is increment. Now, if action dot type is increment, what does this reducer function return? Anyone? What should it return? Nope. Render would happen later. State plus one. Very good, Palak. State is our counter, right? So state plus one would be returned in here. Else if action dot type is decrement, we'd be returning state minus one. Plus, we also came across one particular point here that, let's say, if no action types match, then the render function will return the current state. So we'll do that as well. So the else portion, you can also go for a switch case. As of now, just go with the if else. Action dot type, if anything doesn't match, it'll just return the state that is there. All right. So this is our counter reducer to start with. We'd come back to this reducer once there is there's one more line to be added, but it will come back soon. All right. So I believe everyone is clear on the counter reducer. Very good. What about other participants? Very good. And can anyone tell me what should be the next step? After the reducer, what should we be working on? You can recall the diagram and everything would fall into the place. Render on click, yes, but later. Mixit says state. Jinesh has the correct answer, store. All right. Store, very good, Ketan. I believe everyone recalls store is something that is the main thing, right? We'd have to work on that. Everyone recalls that, yes, as per the diagram. All right, and now you must have observed that we have not used Redux at all, because this is like core JavaScript. This is vanilla JavaScript that we are using. No need of Redux. Now, in order to create a store, Redux would be required. All right, so we would be importing Redux. I can just go for some Redux CDN, and that Redux CDN would just be imported. Maybe we can just go with the minified version. We'll copy the script tag, paste it in here. All right, and hope doesn't give us any error. Yep. So now we'll be creating the store. So it'll be something like const store is equal to redux.createStore. And the createStore function, it accepts one argument minimum, and that is the reducer. If you don't pass any argument, it'll probably give us an error. Yep, expected the reducer to be a function. There's nothing passed in here, undefined is passed. So here there is only one reducer, so we'd pass it on. But usually, if there are multiple reducers, it would be the root reducer, the main reducer that will be created and passed on. But right now there's only one reducer, so we'd consider it the root reducer. All right, so counter reducer, we'd be passing it in. So we are not calling the counter reducer, remember. It is Redux that we'd be calling the counter reducer. So here is our store. And then store has a function. If I do a console.log store.getState, we'll try to figure out what this get state would give us to start with. All right. So first let me tell you what would happen if I do a redux.createStore and I pass in the counter reducer. Redux would call the counter reducer initially automatically internally, and it would not pass any arguments to this particular reducer. So which means state would be undefined and action would be undefined. So basically there'll be no matches that will be happening in here, and the return state would happen, which is undefined, and that would be stored inside the inside the value of the store. So if I do a store.getState, what do you think should be displayed in the console to start with? Rita says 0, Palak says undefined, Mixit says undefined. Now undefined happens to be a data type in JavaScript, and because I think I might have to save it, because there is nothing passed inside the state to start with, it is undefined. All right, so what we should do is for the initial call, we should check whether the state is undefined or not. And in JavaScript, there's an operator called typeof. So if typeof state, which returns us a string, which is basically the data type of that variable, if this is undefined, then return. What do you think we should return in here? What do you think would be the initial value of the state? 0. All right. So if state is undefined, we would return 0, and this would happen only once, that is initially, and every other time it will be something out of these three that would be happening. All right, so now if I refresh, I get store.getState in the line number 47 to be 0. All right, so I would just like to confirm from all that everyone is clear on how did we set the initial state, right? Okay, very good. And we don't need to go for the get state here, but we'll go into that in the render function. So counter h2 dot inner HTML is equal to store dot get state, something like this. And once we do it, we'd get the initial state over here. So whatever we return in the reducer, for example, return 10, and if I reload, you'd get 10 as the initial state. All right, so this is clearly showing us that the reducer is being affected, or the reducer is affecting the store. All right, so this is it. And in the increment buttons on click, decrement buttons on click, what do you think we should be doing? For example, in the increment, what do we need to do? And that one keyword that I mentioned, call an action. What is the exact word for an action that we use? A very important word that I mentioned, dispatch. Very good, Shweta. Shweta says dispatch, and Rita mentioned call and action, but I believe everyone agrees with both of them. We'll be dispatching an action in here. Yes, everyone? All right. And especially Devin. Right, very good. So we'll go with store.dispatch. And I can actually go for an object literal, like type is equal to increment. This can be done, but we already have the increment variable created as an object. So I'll pass that variable in, increment action. And here, store.dispatch, decrement action. All right. So if we go for increment and decrement action, and now if I start clicking the plus and minus, do you think that everything would work? Yes or no? Mixit says no. Right, Rita says no as well. Any other participants, any different ideas? Everyone say no. Render is missing. Very good. Very good, Mixit. So if I reload and if I start clicking on plus, or if I click on minus a couple of times, it will not change the UI. It would change the state though. Store.getState. Here it becomes 7. If I click it a couple of more times, it becomes 9. So the store.getState is happening. Render is missing. So if we go for render like this, everything would work, all right, except for the fact that, so this would work because we are re-rendering stuff, all right. So this is something that is going to work. But the problem is, like, this is a very small program, and keeping render after every store.dispatch, that is fine. I mean, this is possible in this program. But in a bigger program, when there'll be so many other files, like in a create React app application, it'll be always difficult to keep track of every dispatches and manually keep rendering the whole UI. So it is one function that we'll be using, which is the listener function that I described. That is store.subscribe, and I'll pass in render. I'll not call the render function, just pass it in. So store.subscribe, basically it's subscribing to the state changes, and whenever the state is changed, so dispatching an action triggers this particular action and automatically invokes the reducer. So reducer returns as a new state, and that is something that is changed inside the store. And whenever the store changes, the subscribe would happen and render would be called automatically. So we now don't have to call render again and again for every dispatch. And this time around, we are even more sure, because this time it would only be rendering once the store is changed and not before that. So if I now hit on plus or minus, it would keep on changing. All right. So this is a very basic example of Redux, but I believe you know how this store, action, and reducers, they come into the picture, they gel up together, put in together, and it gives us a whole application with a global store. So I believe everyone understands this particular program that we did, right? Very good. I'd like to have a confirmation from everyone so that we're on the same page. Very good. Very good, guys. All right. So this is how Redux comes into the picture. But again, this is a very basic example. So essentially, we don't use Redux for this small example, but this was just so that we get the whole aspect of how Redux entities can be used with one another. So now we'll apply the same thing in a React.js application. So let me just go for a create React app. We'll call it Redux React demo. All right, let's have it created. Let's wait for it to get created. And the whole benefit of having a create React app created is that it would help us to understand how would the file structure be. as far as the React.js program is concerned, because we know that it would be we know that it will be something which is going to have a lot of folders created, like actions would have a different folder, reducer would have a different folder, and so on and so forth. So this create React app helps us to know that how React and Redux work together. I can also do it in an HTML file with the CDN approach, but that is not I want to do. That is not what I want to do. I would like to implement eventually into a task manager. So for that, this create React app would be really helpful. And Rita asks, in command window, what is npx? Npx, I guess it is node package execution, or basically it is I don't know the full form, but it is for executing global commands. So Angular's project creation, or create React app, or something called a JSON server, if you don't want to install, because nowadays what happens is you might not have permissions in your work computers to install npm repositories globally. So without installing, you can execute any global entity that is there. So create React app being a global entity, we can execute it without installing through npx. So this is available when you install Node.js altogether. And if you have create React app installed globally, then you don't have to use npx. All right, it's basically for execution, something related to execution. Let's just check though. I tend to have forgotten the full form of npx. Maybe it would not have any full form. That's what I read, I guess. Like npx full form. Npx node package execute. Yep, node package execute. But then it is from some other website. No official website. We cannot depend on that. But it is essentially to execute the packages directly. Yep, Jinesh also says the same. All right, so yeah, that's clear, right, Rita? What it is used for essentially. Very good. And this is installing. So as I was talking about the create React app application, the create React app itself would be something that we would be executing or basically creating an app, and then we'd be having different folders for different things. Like actions would be a folder, of course components is a folder, and then there will be reducers, store would be in a separate file. So that kind of a setup is what we are looking for. All right, and that's why create React app is what I have used, and not the usual CDN approach. Right, so I think a few final set of dependencies that have to be installed and we'll be ready. So let's wait for it. All right, and I'd go into the Redux React demo and go for a yarn start. Also open it in my code, by the way, and I'll do a yarn start. Okay, so this starts up my project, and it is our src folder, and I'll go for the counter component, or maybe I'll create a components folder first, like we do for all components, and a counter folder, and it'll have a file called counter.jsx. All right, so we need this to be a counter, right? So I would I can go for it to be a functional component, and I don't think there'll be any problem with it. So let's create it as a functional component. Like I'll not be implementing the counter at all. At this point, I'll just create that view, that skeleton that we want to create. So import React from React, and const counter is equal to, we'll have a prop, and it'll have two functions, increment and decrement. All right, it would return us I'll go for a React fragment to be returned. There'll be h2 saying counter, and here is where I'm planning to have the value of the counter, like 0 or something, later down the line, dynamic value from the Redux store. And then a couple of buttons, plus and minus. And on click of those buttons, we'd go with increment, and on click, I'd go with decrement, and I do an export default counter. All right, so just a skeleton, no functionality at all. It doesn't matter whether we create it as a class component or a functional component, because this would not require a state at all. It would be the global Redux state that will be coming into this particular component. All right, so we're not going for the state at all. So I believe this counter component that I have created, this component is clear to all, right? All right, if it is not clear, please let me know. But if it is clear, please confirm so that we can move forward. All right, very good. What about other participants? Okay, so we would be, so if there's only one function, why not we do just export counter? Well, Shubham, we can do an export counter. It totally depends on what you are following as a pattern. So because there is only one function, I have done export default counter. That is also a reason, I see it in that manner. Like if there is only one function, I do an export default because that's the only one function that we need to export. But if there are multiple functions, then we go for normal exports. That's why multiple exports would be possible. So we would see that in the actions that we create, there'll be multiple actions that we'll be creating. At that point, we'd go for export and not export default. So I see it differently, but you can go with just export counter, and that would also be fine. All right, export const counter, and that would also be okay. There's no, like, there's only one pattern that you have to choose and you have to follow. That's basically what it is. All right. Okay, so the view is done. I'd call it in the app component. So let me just get rid of the header, and let's get rid of the logo as well. And I'd import counter from components, counter.jsx, and counter here. All right, something like this. Doesn't do anything at all. I'll also open up my console. All right. So this being done, we would like to now go to the next step. We have our app covered. We have our view created. Now, what would be the next step in this particular case? Anyone? Just repeating what we did earlier. Recall the PDF that I showed you and tell me what could be the next step after the view. Action. Very good, Shubham. I believe everyone would agree with Shubham and Rita as well. Shubham and Rita say actions. So yes, we'll be creating actions. I'll create a separate folder for actions. And this time around, I'd be creating action generators. So action generators are functions that return action objects. So we can create action objects like we created in the previous example, but creating functions gives you one possibility of doing some programming before returning an action object. So we would create action generators. That is always a good practice. So it would be functions that would be returning objects. So I'll create a new file here. So it'll be, we may say counter actions.js. All right. And here I'll go with const increment action. And this time around, increment action would be a function. So wherever we would be dispatching the action, we'd actually call a function. And that increment action returns us, we know that action has to have a type. So it returns us type increment, and const decrement action returns us type decrement. All right, this would be done. And we'd be exporting this as well, because we are going to import these actions in respective components to dispatch them. So we'll be exporting it. All right, so these are the two actions that I have created. These are action generator functions, which are returning as action objects. One and the same thing, but it allows us some programming to be done before returning the object. So it's a good practice to follow. I believe everyone is clear on the actions that I have created. All right, very good. Very good. And then the next step, what would be the next step, guys? After actions, reducer. Very good, Shubham and Janesh. So it create reducers as a folder. Very good, Nirmal and Rita. And we'll create a file. We'll call it counter reducer.js. I'm just keeping elaborate names, which is also a good practice, by the way, so that we know what is there inside the file. And we would go for const counter reducer, which will be, I'm creating it as a fat arrow function. And again, we'll be exporting this as well. And a reducer accepts two arguments. What are the two arguments that a reducer accepts? State and action. State and action. And in ES6, there is also a possibility where we can define some default values. So you don't have to go for that whole type of kind of a thing. If state is not passed, that is the initial point where the state would not be passed. At that point, we just have 0 as the initial value. All right, so default value possibility is there. And we'd go for, let's say, switch action dot type, and the case would be increment. So if the case is increment, we return state plus 1, as we did for the if statement. If the case is decrement, we return state minus 1. Oops, state minus 1. What else can we do in here? Anyone recall the switch case syntax from any programming language? What else can be done? Which default, right? It'll be default. Very good. Nirmal has the exact answer. Default return state. All right, default return state. So this is your counter reducer, increment, decrement, and then the default case as well. I believe this is clear to all. Yes. All right, very good. What about other participants? Okay, so reducer being done. Next step, of course, we know that it is the store. I would create the store in a separate file, which would be there inside the src. Now, in order to create a store, we would need Redux. Up till this point, we didn't install Redux at all. So now we'd be installing Redux. We'll be going for yarn add Redux. All right, let's wait for it to get installed. Okay, so this being installed, we know that there is a create store function. So I'd import create store from Redux, and I'll create our store, create store like so. But then createStore also requires a reducer to be passed in. So I'd import that reducer as well. So import counter reducer from reducers counter reducer, and I'll pass it in here. Minimum one counter reducer is required, and I'd export default store. Only one thing to export in here, and that is the store. So here we have created different things in different files. That's how it will go for our task manager application as well. And I would import the store in my index. So import store from store, and I'll first of all do a console log store.getState. Oops, something like this. So if I go for store.getState now, based on whatever we have created, and if I save it, what do you think would be the output on the console? What would we get as state for now? Rita says 0. Any other suggestions from anyone? Shweta says 0. All right. Palak says 0. Okay. Let's see, just breathe also. So let's see, if I save it, our app would re-render, or app would refresh, I'm sorry. And there you go, you get 0 as the initial state, and that is coming in from the reducer. So if I change it to say 100, for example, the default value would be 100. It is coming in into the console over here. All right. So I believe the whole things that we did for actions, reducer, and then creating the store and displaying the store in here, I believe this is clear to all, right? Now, so why it comes as 0 to start with, that is also clear. Yes, everyone? Very good. Very good. And now I am in my index.js, and I want to send the store from the index.js to my counter.jsx, which is called inside the app component. So what do you think? How would I send the store from my index.js to my counter.jsx so that I can display it inside the counter component? Anyone, any ideas? Importing the counter in, I have already imported, importing the counter in index. Okay, that will be really far-fetched, Rita. But we've already done something similar where we pass data from one component to the other. How have we done it? Props. Very good, Jinesh. We can go for props. We can pass the store as a prop to the app component. App can then pass the store as a prop to the counter. Remember, this is something that we are trying to avoid, but right now there's no other way that we can go for it. So I would like to go for the props and drill down those props as we did in the task manager right now, which we are trying to avoid, by the way. This would be avoided when we use the library React Redux. But today we are not learning React Redux as a library. We are just going for Redux only. So I'll be passing it as a store, as a prop. So I'll create a prop called store. I'll go for the value that is store in the app. All right. So this is my app component. I believe everyone should be clear. Why am I passing it as a prop? So that I can pass this again as a prop to the counter component. Yes, everyone? Very good. So I'll pass the whole store, go into the app component, pass it down to the counter component, like store. I'll have to take in the prop here. Props.store. And I'd go into my counter component. And we do have the props. So I'll just extract the props in here, const store from props. And in the counter, what do I do? Store, and then what? This is the Redux store, remember. We have one function that will get you the current value. Anyone recalls it from the previous discussion that we had? Get state, very good, Janesh. Get state, store.getState. Hopefully we get the store, it is 100 right now. I think I have to edit it to 0. All right. So now it is all about counter component. We have this store.getState. I believe everyone gets the whole passing of prop and the store.getState function. I'd just like to confirm from all that why am I using the store.getState here. All right. So now what is the next thing that we do in here? Store.getState is done. Say I want to click on the plus button and increase the store value. So what do I do in the increment function? Store plus one, we don't do it directly. We have already done it in the reducer. We have called, and Rita says call the action. But what is the exact word that we are looking for here? What has to be done to the action? Call the action, yes, but dispatch. Very good. Dispatch the action. So for that, we'd have to import both the actions, like import from counter actions. I'd import increment action. Actually, I can do something like this as well, like import star as actions from counter actions. So what we can then go for is, this is an alias of all the exports, and it's an object created with methods basically. So actions dot increment action, and we would go for a store dot dispatch here, and store dot dispatch actions dot decrement action in this particular case. All right. So this is one more variation of the import statement, where if we want to import everything, which we want in this particular case from the counter actions, is importing everything as star, and we are assigning it to one particular object, which we can call as properties then, or methods, whatever. All right. So this store.dispatch, both increment and decrement action, and this import, I believe it's clear to all. Very good. I would like to have a confirmation from every participant here, because this is a new syntax that we have in here. Very good. Nice. So now, do you think that it will work if the UI is already refreshed? If I just keep on hitting plus and minus, it would not. What is missing in here? We need to subscribe. Very good. Jinesh says we need to subscribe. So we would subscribe, but again, we would do it in a very dirty fashion this time around. And when this React Redux library would come into the picture, the subscribe would even be better. All right. So as of now, I just create a function render in which I go for React DOM.render. All right. As soon as I save it, everything would go, because this is a function now, and we'd have to call this one initially. All right. So that the application renders. Let's wait for a while. Right. And we do a subscribe now. So store.subscribe render. So here, the only problem, now this would work, okay? If I keep on hitting plus and minus, this would work. But the only problem is that this render does a React DOM.render, which is actually rendering the whole application, which React should not do. All right. React is known for not rendering the whole application. But as I said, like here, we don't have any option. There is a React Redux kind of a library that would actually help us doing the render. But this time in this exercise, we'll just do this kind of a render. All right. So I believe the whole process, where if I, for example, start with the counter component, if I dispatch an increment action, the increment action, which is this one, is dispatched, which has the type increment, and the reducer is invoked automatically, in which this case is executed. This case returns a state +1, so the incremented value would be the new state. And because we have done this subscribe, whenever the store changes, the application re-renders with a new store, and as a result, the counter component would get the new value of the state. And that is the whole thing that is happening. Looks really simple, but we know that what is going on internally. All right. So I believe this whole process, this whole flow of data, that is clear to you all? Yes, everyone? Very good. Very good. And in this particular application itself, I would like to add one more feature. The new problem statement that I want to go for is that I want to add one more counter in here in the form of a component, and that will be an even number counter. So that if I click on plus, it increments by 2, and if I click on minus, it decrements by 2. So it'll be like 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and so on, and decrement would be the same way. All right. So for that, I would create another component. I'll call it even counter, and that would have its own file, even counter.jsx, and that would be my even counter component. I'll create it as a functional component because it doesn't matter. We create it as a class or a functional component, will be fine. So import React from React and const even counter props, and it would be same as the counter component. So I'll copy most of it, or maybe I can just copy this for now. All right, we don't need the store.dispatch at this point. We're just trying to create a skeleton, and we call it even counter, and I do an export default. All right, and I would display this even counter right below the counter component. Go for an HR tag, even counter. For now, I'll just display it. All right, so I get the output. So I believe everyone is clear, first of all, on the problem statement, right? Like, what do I want to achieve as far as this whole setup is concerned about React and Redux? Everyone is clear with the problem statement? Very good. Very good. Nice. So we have our view ready. Again, we'll go through the same routine. There'll be slight change at the end. We'll see what it is. After the view is ready, what can be the next step really quickly? What would be the next step? Action. Very good. Jinesh, I'm sorry. So I'll create a new file, even counter actions.js, and I would have even increment action exported, which should return us a type even increment. All right, and I'm not going for the type to be increment because increment, the action type increment, it is already there. All right, it is already declared. So there is also one thing about actions that we should write down in here, that all the action types must be unique throughout the whole application. All right, the action types should be unique throughout the whole app. All right, even increment, export const even decrement action, and return type even decrement. By the way, the reason for why this should be unique, I have not described it yet. All right, maybe we may find it out later, but just keep it in mind that every action should be unique. All right, so I believe these two actions, they are clear, right? And can anyone also tell me what could be the next step that we should be going for? Reducer. All right, we'll create another reducer here. We'll call it even counter reducer.js, and we'd have even counter reducer, which will be state and action. All right, and switch action dot type if the case that we have is even increment, return. Here we'll go for state plus 2, case, even, decrement, return state minus 2, and default, return state. All right. The way that we had it for the normal counter, we are now having it for the even counter, except for the fact that it is state plus 2 and state minus 2, and even increment, even decrement cases. Oh yes, state to be 0. I'll have the state to be incremented by 2, just so that it is bifurcated. All right, like 0 and 2, they are different. All right, so so that we know when this implements, or when we implement this, we know the difference. Thank you, Palak, for that. Initialization is necessary. All right, so this is the counter reducer. Now what do we do? Now what would we do? What would we do the next step inside this particular program? Palak says store, but the problem is, or not even a problem, it's a sort of a facility, that store is already created. All right, so store is already created. It is having the counter reducer. We have already established that we would not have multiple stores. So now what should we do is, there is a counter reducer. We also have another reducer, that is the even counter reducer. And here we'll be combining both the counter and even counter reducer to create one root reducer. All right, so how would we be doing it is root reducer. Oh, sorry, not root reducer. It's combineReducers from Redux. And I would import even counter reducer from reducers, even counter reducer. All right, and we'd create a root reducer here, so that we can, because the createStore accepts only one reducer, so we cannot pass two reducers in the createStore method. So we have to combine them to a root reducer. So I'll create const root reducer is equal to combineReducers, and inside the combineReducers method, we would like to have the shape of the state created. And if you recall, I already mentioned that in real world projects, the store would always be an object. All right, so here is how we create that particular store. I go for an object and I decide the shape of my store now, where I need counter to whatever the counter reducer returns, and even counter will be whatever the even counter reducer returns. And instead of the counter reducer, we pass the newly created root reducer. Now this, if I save it, this would right away give me an error, and we'll come to that error in a while. But I believe this whole combineReducer and creating a root reducer and passing it down to the createStore, this whole process is clear to all. Very good. I'd like to confirm from every participant here. All right. So this being clear, if I go to my index.js where I'm importing my store, and if I simply do a console.log of store.getState, earlier, if you may recall, the store was a number. It was giving us 0. But now, if I check the initial state, it is now not a number. It is an object, store.getState. It is having two properties, counter and even counter. Counter is 0, even counter is 2, all initialized by their respective reducers. So now, first of all, we need to solve this error inside this counter action. Oh, sorry, inside the component that is the counter component, right? Where we are going for a store.getState. But this time around, the store.getState is an object with two properties. So here, what should we be going for? Store.getState dot what? Very good, Jinesh and Rita. Store.getState. Palak says into the bracket 0. But Palak, because this is not an array, this is an object. All right. It is to be something like this, store.getState.counter. That's what Jinesh and Rita mentioned. How to access even counter. Yes, I would come to that access of even counter as well, Sheta. But this counter that I have created now, which would still work. It is still working condition only, no changes in that. This is clear to everyone. Why did I go for store.getState.counter in this particular case? All right. Shweta says 0. So basically, Shweta, what happens is the get state is an object. So, if I store this into like, let's say const state is equal to store.getState. And if I do a console log of state, you'd see that in the counter.jsx line number 18, we get an object which has two properties, counter and even counter. So if I want to access one of the properties, I'll just go for like store.counter or store.even counter, whatever I want to access. This would give me 0 over here. That's what I'm doing. Like is the only thing is, like, instead of storing it in a separate state variable, I'm just accessing it directly. So I can also do this like state.counter. That would also be fine. All right, this can also be done if we want to. But yeah, so I just didn't use that extra variable. That was it. So I just did store.getState.counter. And that gave me 0. The rest of the things are working. All right, plus and minus and all. Now it's the turn of the even counter. Let's close everything up. Let's start with the app component. App.js. We are passing the store to the counter. We'd also pass the store to the even counter. All right, props.store. And in the even counter component, here I would like to display the store. I'll get it from the props first. So const store is equal to props. And what I'll do is store dot get state dot, what do you think should be done in here? Store dot get state dot. Shweta, if you can answer. Even counter, very good. So now you get it. Even counter would give me even counter to be 2. Plus minus would not do anything. So obviously, what should be done in increment and decrement in here? What actions should be dispatched? We have these actions like even increment action, even decrement action. So these would be dispatched. So I would import them. So import star as actions from actions even counter actions. And I'll go with store.dispatch actions dot even increment action to be called as a function, and store.dispatch actions dot even decrement action to be called as a function. So now with the dispatches in, we also have the subscribe in the index.js. So we have that re-rendering mechanism already in place. So if I go for plus over here, minus over here, this would also work. And if I go for plus over here, this would work totally differently, right? This console log is still staying the same because this is only once that is logged. So I'll just get rid of that console log. We don't need it. All right. So coming back to this, we'd get 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 separate from the normal counter increment decrement that we have. All right. So this is the exact use of combined reducers that we did inside the store. And in all the programs that we do from now on, whether or not we are using multiple reducers, we'll always go for a combined reducer function. All right. Always a combined reducer function would be used. And that is sort of a standard. All right. So I believe everyone is clear on this combined reducer that I have implemented with the counter reducer and even counter reducer. Yes, everyone? Everyone is clear on this even counter and counter combination that we did? Yes, everyone? All right. Very good. So this is what we'd be doing in the next session, but with our task manager project. Thereby, we'd also be learning an additional tool, which is React Redux. So let's go for it in the next session. So here we conclude our session. And if anyone has any questions, please let me know. Else say 0 so that we can conclude the session. All right. Okay. So here we have it. Oh, I'm sorry, Rita. The query just got lost in the chat. I didn't reply to it, right? What was the query again? Okay. Yeah. So Rita has a query that you have declared the state with errors as object and defining its properties in form with. So is it a proper method? It's an empty object, but if we define the errors with some properties also, it is working. So I believe Rita is talking about the task manager. Let me just quickly open it up. Yep, login.jsx. So here I have declared login states errors as a blank object. So it is actually fine because JavaScript is loosely typed, and that is the benefit that we are using in here, where we are setting the username and password to some values. So if we declare it with blank object, or if we declare it with some data in it, like some properties in it, both would be fine. Here it would just be the case where your errors is not unnecessarily populated if there are no errors at all. So if the whole form is valid, the object doesn't have to be even populated. So that's the premise that we are using in here. But if you use some username or password fields, it would still work. There'll be no problem in that. And this is also a good way to go for, so that our code doesn't get unnecessarily populated. Imagine if you have like 10 controls, and if every control has 2 to 3 error messages that you want to display, in that case the errors would be like 20-30 properties, which we would like to avoid. So that's why the error being a blank object, and we can real time populate this with some data. All right. So that was the whole thinking behind this error being a blank object. Okay. So I believe we can call it a day, and we'll see you tomorrow. Oh, sorry, not tomorrow, but on Friday, where we'll be going for the rest of the topics, that is Task Manager and Redux application. So bye everyone. Have a nice day and take care.